Good evening, I'm Liam Durcan. One of the great privileges of practicing medicine is being allowed into the lives of your patients. They tend to tell you things, what they hope for and what they dread. And if you're attentive, patient by patient, story by story, you become aware of that huge spectrum of human behavior. An example of this is particularly intriguing to me. Some people completely freak out over something trivial like forgetting their umbrella on a rainy day, while other patients respond to a diagnosis of Lou Gehrig's disease with complete calm and equanimity. The doctor in me, the listener and the curator of these histories, marvels at the variety and unpredictability of people's responses to adversity. We seem truly made of different stuff. As a neurologist, I wonder, as anyone interested in the brain would tend to do, what could possibly explain why some people are more or less vulnerable to personal disaster? Why are some of us resilient? Let's start with a few simple observations. Developmental psychologists have found that in any group of children exposed to traumatic early life experiences or deprivations, there will be many who suffer with limited abilities to cope in later life. Depression and anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms, and higher rates of suicide. But there are others, often 15 to 20% of any high-risk group, who face those same challenges and yet flourish and develop into healthy, resilient adults. What explains these outliers? Are there brain differences that confer resiliency on some of us? It seems that when it comes to resilience, like many other capacities, we're not simply a blank slate, doomed to mirror and recreate the traumas that we experience. Our different responses to stress may be determined, at least in part, by the way our brain responds, and some of that is determined. The repertoire of dopamine receptors we're born with, whether we have inherited mutations in our serotonin systems, or how our hypothalamus is wired to affect our endocrine response to stress. A number of genes have been identified with heightened stress sensitivity and risk for anxiety after stress. This isn't to say that we're hardwired for resiliency or vulnerability. These genes only confer susceptibilities, not ironclad certainties. And that is how our environment, our family, our culture, and sometimes nothing more than the simple vagaries of good or bad luck enter the discussion. Many of us may never know the genetic vulnerabilities we harbor if we're never challenged. And those of us lucky enough to hold a royal flush of resiliency genes may similarly be overwhelmed if we're faced with endless catastrophe and personal loss. As the brain shapes experience, experience also shapes the brain. And that's become increasingly acknowledged in research that attempts to understand the biologic processes that underlie resilience. Studies are showing that early life trauma can lead to structural changes in our brains that may affect the way we respond to stress later in our lives. From the amount of adrenaline we secrete in response to stress to the size and structure of crucial brain regions, the hippocampus and the amygdala, involved in memory and fear response. The good news is that while the brain may respond structurally to trauma in a negative way, the fact that it responds at all opens the door to other, more positive possibilities. In other words, humans can learn and they can change their brains. Children who've experienced developmental delay because of traumatic experiences can catch up when placed in loving and supportive environments. Many people who are able to master mild to moderate stressors are often better able to deal with subsequent major stressors, as though a form of stress inoculation has occurred. And children with a sense of an internal locus of control tend to be far more resilient. And this, to some degree, can be taught. Simple reorientation of attitudes can help foster resilience at any time in our lives. And so with resilience, as with so many other facets of personality, we're not blank slates nor finished products, but something magnificently and terrifyingly in between. We can't do much about our genetic starting points except to have it used cynically as an excuse for doing nothing at all about the things we can change. And that sort of nihilism negates the one truth of our real endowment. We possess brains with a capacity for change. The philosopher William James whose intellect also encompassed the fields of psychology and physiology, famously said, "The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another." And while that makes sense, it's also a bit condescending. Just perhaps a bit of a hint of 19th century white male privilege in Dr. James' advice. Just think other thoughts, people. What do you do if the only alternative to thoughts about the poverty of your home life are thoughts about the poverty of your neighborhood? We have those sorts of thoughts in Canada right now. Resilience may be in our heads, but because that capacity exists in every head, it becomes like language or creativity, capable of transcending the personal and becoming communal, becoming transformative. It's easy to imagine that we individually and collectively are in small ways continually influencing the resilience of others around us, our children, our coworkers, even complete strangers in an auditorium. Our choice, then, is to understand whether we will regard resilience as something merely personal, something that's nothing more than a commodity, some sort of mysterious power to be attained, cashed and used against those who lack it for our advantage. Or is resilience something potentially more, something truly communal, something for which each one of us bears some responsibility for fostering in others as well as ourselves? Thank you.